So that American music should really sound great, we had a Steinway piano here. I must say that Russian music doesn't sound any worse on it. And right now, let's continue our discussion, which we broke off at an extremely interesting question. Who's going to take that question? Academic Arbatov.
I'll start, and somebody else can follow. I wouldn't say no, I've been elected 3 times. I wouldn't say that I was entirely calm each time, even though I didn't have any opposition. In the first place, what happens before the election, whether you're going to be a candidate or not, whether they're going to accept you as a candidate. Then, if there will be a lot of electors voting against you, that is a certain moral damage that you suffer. It's not, doesn't look good in your record. And then, what will happen? 2 years ago, we didn't have any idea what was going to happen now, so very likely in the future, we can hardly foresee what is going to come. But what if I guess, I will say that very likely there's going to be many more demands made upon electors. They're going to make many more requests of us. We're going to have to work even more seriously with our electors, and I think we've got to prepare for that. I don't think our lives are going to become easier, but rather harder. That's not bad, though.
Go ahead, go ahead.
Comrade Arbatov said that we're not professionals, and that we have to earn a living in addition to being members of the Supreme Soviet. I, here, am a professional who doesn't do anything other than this, and I'm well paid besides. Sometimes my comrades say jokingly that because of your position of a deputy chairman of the Supreme Soviet, you often have a chance to come to Moscow. And when I come home, they say, "You just go there to get your paycheck." But that's just a joke, of course. In fact, our system is such that the deputy chairman of the Supreme Soviet has to spend a month or so at a time in Moscow, and it's a very good education for him, since he has to deal with issues relating to the whole country. Now, I'm not a member of any standing committees, but I do have a number of obligations nonetheless. I try to be as available as possible to my electors, especially in the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. Anybody can come there and visit me there. That's all the deputies at all levels and all participants in the Second World War in particular have free access at all times to the chairman of the Supreme Soviet. I would like to, in this connection, ask a question. Could I?
Please.
Sometimes we are reproached that there's so much unanimity in the adoption of decisions in the Supreme Soviet. Now, of course, the matters are often gone over in great detail in the standing committees first, and therefore we know all about the issues first. But I'm wondering if this is what happens in the United States. The president has the right to veto a bill, and in that connection, what is the position of the congressman? How does the congressman feel if a bill is vetoed by the president after they have discussed it and adopted it?
Bill, did you hear the question?
Yes, I did hear the question. It's a good question. Congressman Brown, would you like to take a crack at it? Well, I would say that the Congress feels that when it has passed the bill, it has examined it exhaustively, it has understood all of the issues completely, and if the Congress feels very strongly that the bill is a proper bill, they will override the President's veto almost without a second thought. And the Congress has done that twice already this year on very important legislation for the welfare of the country, in which the President vetoed it because he had a different philosophy about the particular program that those bills represented. The Congress does have access to a great deal of information about the subjects that they're working on, and while there is controversy representing different philosophies, we have a surprising amount of agreement in our committees when they report out legislation, and it would normally be the situation that a committee would report out a bill by very, very large majorities, if not unanimously. But there is always room for substantial disagreement and debate, and we protect this freedom of debate as one of the highest values of this country.
George, could I add just one thing to that this doesn't necessarily go down party lines. Many of us in the Republican Party, as I am a Republican, and generally vote very closely with the President on his various programs. He recently vetoed the highway bill. I thought he was in error on that, and I voted against him on that, and we overrode that veto despite the fact that that was a very
I'm sorry, Congressman. Moscow is not getting our connection. What would you like me to do about this? We've lost this. Okay, they're hearing us now. Would you like to you want to follow up on the electoral question?
Yes, I'd like to follow up on the question that we were talking about. We in the United States are very, very fascinated by Mr. Gorbachev and the change that we're seeing come into the Soviet Union, the new openness. I think I'm particularly interested in the political system and having our counterpart there. I'm being very fascinated by that. I'm very curious as to what changes do you see, or what problems do you see that will evolve as a result of the new election laws?
We had a system of...
And I don't think they're hearing us.
I don't think so either. He's talking.
We're not hearing them.
Can you hear us? Okay, the satellite's on. Okay. Try it again.
Did they hear any of the answer? Did they hear any of George's answer? I think that was a very interesting question.
Can you hear us? We hear you fine.
Can you hear us?
Do you hear us? We hear you very well.
Okay, well, we'll begin again with Congressman George Brown. Did you hear him before?
No, we didn't hear you
Okay,
before.
well, we'll begin again. We'll re-roll the tape. Hello, Congressman George Brown, can I pass the... Please, Congressman Brown.
Well, I'll be very brief. I said in response to the question that in the Congress, when we pass legislation, we subject it to a great deal of study. Normally, even on important legislation, we can pass it by very large majorities, and if the President decides to veto it, the Congress will, as it has done twice this year, override the President's veto, because we think that the study that we have given to that legislation gives us a better judgment than the President might have. And that was the essence of what I said.
And if I might add to that, I think it's a question of that the President doesn't even necessarily get the support of his own party in situations where individual members may think that their interest of their constituents is more important, or if the President is indeed wrong. This was the case in the highway bill, one of the ones that Congressman Brown is referring to. I, as a Republican, as well as many other Republicans, voted against the President. We overrode his veto because we thought that the continuation of the highway program was very important. We got into the electoral process that I'd like to pursue here, if we might. We in the United States are very, very fascinated with the change that we're seeing in the Soviet Union, the new openness, the democratization, the situation where you're actually going in and being critical, where you think that you might be able to make improvements and increase your efficiencies. In the area of the election law, we're particularly interested, and I would like to ask our counterpart in the Soviet Union, Do you see any problems coming about with the new election law, and how do you think that the transition will be made?
Vladimir, please.
The first problem is that we don't have the law yet at all. It's just in the process of preparation. It will be ready by autumn. And we're going to be doing experiments up until then. We're going to have local elections in June. And during the course of this election, we're introducing certain new departures. We have a lot of electoral districts where there will be several candidates, and those districts with several candidates, there will be multi-mandate elections as well. And there will be many candidates contesting the elections. Now, the following thing also, if there are 5 positions available and 6 people try to be elected, so then 5 will be, say if 6 of them get more than 50% of the vote, one of these 6 will then have just to be an alternate. Thus we're going to try various experiments, I'd say, because we don't yet know how it's going to work out. We're just starting the process of putting forward candidacies for these local elections. And there are a lot of candidates now. There's a lot of discussion. Almost every working group has got its own person who they want to be a candidate, and we'll see how it goes. It's an experiment which will help us to work out some ideas for the new electoral law. There'll be some competition, and in this way we hope to democratize the process. There won't be political opposition, but there'll be a lot of different views put forward in the process of these elections. And this is very useful. It will help us, I think, to elect better people, ultimately, to represent the given district. The law will be ready by autumn, and then will be discussed on the countrywide basis, and then it will be adopted.
Thank you. Bill?
Yes, we have.
I think that we're nearing the end of the first part of our discussion. Now I'll give the floor back to you.
Thank you. We have one last question from Congressman Leach, and then we should proceed, as you mentioned, to the second part of the discussion.
Let me just add in this context that we have one major difference between our two systems. We have a multi-party system, you have a single-party system. That comes down to the question how candidates are selected. Will there be actual campaigning? Will there be openness of discussion? Can anyone run? And so the question I would ask to our counterparts is there any thought within the Soviet Union of allowing alternative political parties? Secondly, is there any thought to allowing open campaigning with candidates being able to argue given sides of issues in public formats and debates on television, with or without advertising? And thirdly, can anybody seek a position, or do all the candidates have to be chosen by someone from above, or can they just simply emerge in their own volition from below?
I would, first of all, like to say that we have a different political culture. In our country, it would be unthinkable for a person to put forward his candidacy and say, I want to be president, or I want to be a deputy. This is simply not a criticism of the Americans or reproach to the Americans, just we have a different political culture. In the United States, a person stands up and says, I want to be a congressman or president. In our country, this would be seen as the lack of modesty. In our country, other people put forward the candidacy of a person. The working group, the organization, the trade union, the factory, the artistic organization the person works in, the group of people he works with, they put forward the candidacy of the individual. Now, as concerns a multi-party system or one-party system, now, the United States, as far as I know, has always been a multi-party system. There was a period even before, there's nothing is mentioned in the Constitution about multi-party system, though. Now, I'm not trying to say anything good or bad. In Italy, for instance, you have 8 parties rather than 2, but you can't say the United States is, Italy is 4 times more democratic than the United States as a result of that. And our country, historically, we have it's worked out that we only had 1 party. Right after the revolution, there were 2 parties, and even 2.5 were part of a 3rd party. And then they themselves departed from the coalition, and we ended up with a single party. And in the other socialist countries, there are several parties in several of those. And you could, in principle, imagine a kind of situation with a country with the same kind of social relations as we have, and with not a single party, but with 2 or 3. In theory or in principle, that's possible. We have had some disputes about it, in fact, but we've come to the conclusion that there's nothing in this which would be contradictory of our system. But the question hasn't actually come up, and it's difficult for me to imagine how or on what basis another party would emerge. A party, you've got to understand, after all, is means 20 million people or something like that, 8% of the population. If you have a politically active talk of the politically active population, that would be 30% of the population. Now, President Reagan was elected, and this was considered to be by an overwhelming majority, a landslide victory, and that was 27% voted in favor of him. So if 30%, that is an enormous democratic organization, and very democratic in its principle. We haven't always been totally democratic, but we are starting now to be more democratic inside the party, and as you can see, it's turning into a very democratic institution which will always be able to encompass various opinions, various points of view. And as far as I can see, and I'm sure the others here present will agree with me, very likely all of our demands for discussion, for democratic discussion of the problems which are of concern to us, will be satisfied within the framework of a single party.
Not going to agree with you.
One could not entirely agree with what Arbatov is saying. I agree with him that our party is democratic and is trying to accommodate within it all of the interests of the various aspects of our population, but there still is a question which doesn't require the creation of another party, but the problem is the adequate representation of all interests in the country, not class interests, but social and trade interests of various kinds. This is an issue, and there's a lot of thought being devoted to it now. The structure of organizations is changing, trade union organizations, creative organizations, new types of trade and professional organizations are changing. The functions of the old ones are changing. We have an organization of representing Soviet women, and now it's been changed into an organization which in fact represents the interests of Soviet women before the government. It has the right to put forward draft laws, etc., and petitions, and the functions of other organizations are changing as well. So the question is on the agenda, and it's going to be dealt with. I agree with Mr. Arbatov that we do not need a second party for this under our circumstances. In other circumstances, perhaps this would be necessary, but this is a problem. It is being solved, and I don't think that we're going to solve it all once and for all, but we are seeking.
I'd like to remind you that right now the question was raised in our country at the January plenum of the Central Committee, and that was a very important event in the life of our party, namely that we need to understand the fact that people who are not party members also should have major posts in the country, in the government, even if they are not party members. The party should not be an elitist organization. It should not be an organization which excludes people from major leadership posts. That's also one of the new areas, one of the new assessments that has recently been made in the development of politics. Irina Nikolaevna, yes. For right now, about 30% of the deputies in Gorky are not party members, and in the institute headed by Gaponov, you could already find a lot of such people. It is an important question. I'd like to emphasize the fact as to why the authority of the Communist Party is so great in the Soviet Union. It is because it was that party which helped the people survive in the years of the Civil War, when all countries of the world attacked the young Soviet Republic. It is that party which helped in reestablishing the economy, in living through the ordeals of the Second World War. And after the revolution, helped backwards Russia become the first country to engage in manned spaceflight. That was an enormous deed that the party carried out. And of course, therefore, our people doesn't want any other party. That party has shown itself what it is in extremely difficult circumstances. It has proved itself. And also I'd like to note that our colleagues probably don't understand one thing here. We really want to have several candidates. It will be better if there are several candidates. Of course, each of us might feel bad if we've worked badly, but if my comrades in Gorky decide that somebody else, another person sitting there discussing things, is going to be better at his work in the Supreme Soviet, I'm also going to recognize that fact. And I'll go back to my research activity and training my students. So it'll be easier for us. I think that we don't all have to go be deputies. We're not all going to be deputies, but up till now, until that point when we have several candidates, nobody was trying to reach the top. I remember perfectly well the first time I was very disappointed when a couple of workers' groups, even though they knew our institute, they were familiar with us, they knew me as a doctor, and suddenly they said, well, they want to discuss my candidacy. Discuss. Not simply nominate me, but discuss it. And other medical institutes did that. There were a whole series of meetings, and at that meeting there really were discussions, real discussions of my candidacy as to whether to nominate me or not.
Thank you, Dr. Blokhina, and thank you, Mr. Arbatov, and thank you, Mr. Zagladin, for answering our questions. We now, I understand, are about to move into the second part of our session, and I just want to explain that the interruption in communication that we experienced a little bit, we are told was due to a hurricane at the Soviet ground station for the satellite, which just goes to show you how many difficulties there are in U.S.-Soviet communications. And that is the theme of our second part. I'd just like to begin with a short anecdote. Exactly 2 years ago in April, I was in my hometown in San Francisco, and it was a sunny Sunday, and some fellow got in his sailboat and sailed out under the Golden Gate Bridge, went out a ways, and proceeded to capsize in the Pacific Ocean. Well, he had some flares with him, but the freighters did not see the flares, and so it looked like that might be the end of him. But he had a little radio transmitter, which was emitting a signal, and the signal was picked up by a Soviet satellite overhead that relayed the message to Scott Air Force Base in southern Illinois, which then picked up the phone, called the Coast Guard in San Francisco, which sent a helicopter out to rescue this poor fellow out of the ocean. Now, that happens, and a few weeks ago, as we saw, America was able to reciprocate with the rescue of Soviet sailors. That was an example of effective U.S.-Soviet communication using the very same satellite technology that we are using today. Now, if the United States and the Soviet Union can cooperate like that to save a single human life from a deadly accident, then surely we can cooperate to save all of us from a deadly accident, a nuclear war that no one wants. That is the subject of this joint hearing, is how do we strengthen U.S.-Soviet communication? So I would like all of us to assume for a moment that all 12 of you have constituted yourselves into a joint committee. This is a joint hearing to pursue two questions. First, what concrete steps can be taken to strengthen communication between the governments of our two countries? And second, what concrete steps can be taken to strengthen communication between our citizens so as to lay the long-term foundations for peace? And if I may begin with the first question, we have an expert witness in our audience, Mr. Benjamin Reed, former Undersecretary of State during the Carter administration, very distinguished career, and he has just finished a report which he chaired for the National Academy of Public Administration with a panel of very high-level officials from every administration, from Eisenhower to the current one, on this question of how to strengthen U.S.-Soviet communication. Mr. Reed.
Well, I used to find it very awesome when I had to go up before a committee of Congress, but going up before a committee of both the Congress and the Supreme Soviet, I find absolutely terrifying. But let me switch, if I may, to the government-to-government communications problems and opportunities. I remember shortly after John Kennedy became President of the United States, Llewellyn Tommy Thompson, who was perhaps our best and wisest ambassador to the Soviet Union in the post-war years, told him that both governments tended to see the same actions and interpret them differently, and to hear the same words and to give them different meaning. And I've learned through experience in the Kennedy and Johnson years and the Carter years how very true that is. The differences, that some of which have already been alluded to, of political systems, social systems, differences of language, differences of tradition and outlook, values, interests, are real, and we must not pretend that they do not exist, because they do exist. And there has been a highly competitive relationship between our countries, as we all know, for many, many years. But the opportunities for strengthening communications exist too. And in this panel of the National Academy, which I have had the privilege of leading, we've had an opportunity to look at a number of areas and to address problems which confront both governments, and to be bold enough to suggest some recommendations to both governments of ways to promote communications, not communications at, but communications with, and with the objective of reaching a common understanding of areas of agreement and disagreement. Let me just mention 4 of those areas today, and we touched on 30 or more in our report. First, the knowledge that our national leaders bring to office when they are first given the oath of office. When you look back at the post-war years in the United States, you see only 2 presidents who had any significant prior international experience. None of them, with those same 2 exceptions, none of them had ever visited the Soviet Union, as none of your general secretaries since the war had visited the United States before they took office. They had, neither national leader on either side has ever spoken the language of the other, so that communications always had to be through translators who have a long litany of the problems when great minds thought they were meeting and they found subsequently proof positive that they weren't, some of them all too recent. I would hope very much that you would tolerate the stream of presidential candidates that has started and will continue to go to Moscow in the next year and a half. And I would hope very much that more than the 4 members of the Politburo who have been to this country would visit us. When you haven't seen a country, when you haven't sensed its tempo, when you haven't...
Mr. Reed, I'm going to
let the leaders
move along.
I will move along. The second point, assumptions. Both governments are chronic worst-case planners. Whenever they see an act or hear a word, they are very much apt to place the worst connotation on it. In this report, we've suggested a number of ways in which continuous, mutual assumptions can be shared. And there are many ways in which that can be accomplished. Summits. Number 3. There have been 13 since the war. There have been 2 gaps of 6 years between summits, much too long. They're happening with more frequency now. We're all glad to see. But they should have better records. there should never be surprise attempted at those meetings because security issues are being dealt with. And we should avoid some of the problems that occurred after the Reykjavik meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. We're going to have to...
Fine.
I just want to stop and... Leonid, do you have some questions for our American expert?
What kind of surprises does Mr. Reed have in mind after Reykjavik?
I had in mind the feeling on the part of some of the American participants that the package which was proposed by Mr. Gorbachev was a surprise to them. Perhaps, and I'm quite sure it's the case, that your people would think otherwise, but at least it appeared to be a surprise in its package element. And of course, we're now approaching those problems separately.
Could I say something? I have heard such arguments myself, that there were some surprises at Reykjavik, but I don't understand this. If you read what Gorbachev was saying, and other leaders of the Soviet government, and there are proposals that other negotiations, there could have been any surprises there. 8 or 9 months before that, Gorbachev proposed total elimination of nuclear weapons, and 50% reduction of nuclear weapons had been discussed for a long time, and various components of these proposals had been discussed. I don't think there were any surprises, but this is not what we're talking about now. I'd like to say we're talking now about official contacts. Now, of course, summit meetings are very important. High-level meetings and other levels of official meetings of all kinds are important. But it's important not only that they meet and discuss and that they be good interpreters, and with time, Americans might even start to speak Russian a little bit, which wouldn't be bad, especially if the leaders could do it. But you understand, people have got to not only talk, but understand each other. So you've got to think in the same way. I think the time has come, really, for new thinking. And those who were surprised by Reykjavik were surprised because they thought in the old way. It's necessary to have a new way of thinking, which would start by our being aware or recognizing the fact that even though there is a lot of heterogeneity, a lot of differences, and a lot of acute contradictions in the world, despite all of that, there is an enormous amount of interdependence. Whether we like one another or not is beside the point. We are condemned to live in the world together, and we thus have got to solve the problem of survival and security, which are the most important problems. At that moment, when you understand that, that's when you start to think in a new way, and then it becomes easier to understand a lot of other things. When you understand that you cannot be secured at the expense of the other person's security, and when you understand that security is not a military problem. You cannot secure security by piling up arms. We've been piling up arms for 40 years, and we have less and less security, and if we continue to proceed in the same way, we'll end up very sadly. It seems to me, thus, that for these official relations, it's very important that it's a very good thing to see people shaking hands. The Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the President of the United States and the head of he was also the head of the Republican Party of the United States. It's a very good thing to see them shaking hands, but these should be a supplement to the main thing, which would be reaching understanding. And we have great hopes now, even though I must say that after we reach some agreement, we find that people start becoming very unquiet. And after what Mr. Reed said about after Reykjavik, I had an idea that the United States might withdraw from the SALT II treaty or something like that. Every time with you and with your government we do reach or almost reach some kind of an agreement, then automatically there's some kind of monkey wrench which gets thrown into the works in order to destroy the agreement which has been reached or almost reached. And this is how obligatory, and I'm afraid that something like that might happen again, and we have less and less time.
Thank you, Dr. Arbatov. Thank you, Dr. Arbatov. We actually have a comment from Congresswoman Schneider.
Well, I would like to ask a question of Mr. Reed, and that is that there is no question in my mind that the American people, that the Soviet people, that all the people of the world very much feel that communications are critical, that any opportunity of us getting together is of utmost importance, but we also have a great fear and concern that beyond that there might be some technological occurrence that we may not have control over. And I wonder, Mr. Reed, if you could perhaps elaborate on the risk reduction centers, nuclear risk reduction centers, and what role they play in the communications between government to government.
The risk reduction centers will be established in both Washington and Moscow. I think there's virtual agreement between the governments, although I am not in government anymore, to do so. And the purpose would be to have 24-hour teams on both sides, which would be in constant communication with each other and would be able to alert each other when there were events that struck one side as a matter of concern, and to be able to explain when explanations were possible and to the extent they were possible, because often governments on both sides act in ignorance, as we've learned full well. But that would be a very helpful step, and it would supplement the hotline which has existed since 1963.
Okay. Maybe at this point we can move into citizen exchanges, and I can introduce Colette Schulman, whom, as I mentioned, has been going back and forth between the United States and the Soviet Union for 30 years. She's from Columbia University, and she has been actively involved in many of these citizen exchanges, and we'll now take a look at how these can be used to strengthen U.S.-Soviet communication.
I would like to begin by giving you a small example from the women's dialogue, Soviet-American women's dialogue that I've been participating in, that I think makes an important general point about citizen communication. 20 Soviet and American women were sitting at a table and talking about, would you believe it, men. We were saying, wouldn't it be nice if men would play a larger role in the home, and if they would help more with the chores and the upbringing of the children, things that women often say. We were observing that women have had their roles redefined and expanded by society, and perhaps it's time now to stretch men's roles a little. We were being playful in our comments, but we were also quite serious. And then suddenly, one of the Soviet women said in a very sad and plaintive voice, she said, you know, when I was a little girl growing up in Moscow in the years right after the war, she said there were hardly any men around. Many of them were gone. They were dead. And our mothers worked very hard to be fathers as well. And there wasn't any question at that time of asking men to do more. Now, the American women listened very attentively, and then one of them said, you know, until I met you Soviet women here, I never thought carefully about the implications for you in your lives of the absence of a whole generation of men in your society. Now, to me, this illustrates how the sharing of individual, personal experience can sometimes illuminate the experience of an entire society. It takes our relations away from the abstract level and brings them down to very concrete human terms. And this is what citizen exchange is all about. Now let me end my introductory comments on a much more contemporary note and say that your policy of glasnost, of openness and frankness in addressing your own tasks is a very good thing, and it is earning the respect of the world. It grew out of your own conditions and needs in your society, but I want to tell you that it is also having an influence in Soviet-American citizen exchange by raising credibility. And I think personally that it should bring forth an American response on our side, that our response should be to become more interested in what's going on in your society. And I think I see signs of that already, because I've just come back from Iowa, from Congressman Leach's state, not your district, Congressman, I think the northwest part of it. And there I was talking to people who were sensing the stirrings in your country and asking many interesting questions about them. So one thing that I would like personally is to see more Soviet citizens come to the United States in order to meet with Americans. What are the chances of that? I'd like to hear from our Soviet participants at some point.
We'll ask our experts to answer Ms. Schneider's questions and to express their own opinions on this topic. Professor Bogdanov, please. I'd like to take advantage of this opportunity and to send greetings, the greetings on my part and many of my colleagues, to Congressman Brown and to Congresswoman Schneider. We have the best of memories of their visit to the Institute. We remember the very frank talks which they had with us, and we'd like to ask them not to forget about our invitation. The invitation to visit us remains in force. As to what Colette Schulman said, and she really knows the Soviet Union very well, as was already stated here, it's true. She's been working on the Soviet Union now for 30 years, and she certainly made her contribution to understanding between our two countries. I think it might not be too unpleasant for her if I say that her husband, Marshal Shurun, is one of the major American specialists on the Soviet Union, who for many long years was the head of one of the most respected and authoritative centers in America that deals with the Soviet Union. Now, on the substance of the question, I think that everything Colette Schulman said is perfectly clear. There could be no objections to it. There could be no disagreement as to whether contacts are necessary or not. The only point of concern for me, perhaps not even concern, but I'm a little bit uncomfortable at one thing, and I'm sure that she understands that perfectly well too, that in the last analysis, what is going on today here, the fact that contacts do exist between citizens of the Soviet Union and the United States, all of this depends on the level of the political relations which exist between our two countries. Our citizens don't live in a vacuum, neither yours nor ours. They live within the context of specific states and specific policies of those states. You probably recall, even I recall, that there were periods in our relations when, because of bad political relations, for practical purposes, there really were no contacts between us. I'd simply like to draw your attention to the fact that contacts in themselves are directly dependent, that's the facts of life, on political relations. On the other hand, it's true that our times today are such that personal contacts, too, have an impact on the improvement of political relations as well. There is a kind of dialectics at work here, but we should not forget about either of these two. Both of them have their place to play in this important task of improving relations between our countries.
Bill, may I comment on that?
Professor Guliev, go ahead. May I comment? 1 second, please. You see, a lot of questions were raised here, and they're not all similar, not all on the same level. I could only deal with a few of them. As an independent expert, as distinguished from our legislators here, I could express both my academic point of view and my personal point of view of a citizen. If I use the same kind of methodology as proposed by my colleague, Mr. Reid, then I would say that despite the fact that now we're very critical in our consideration of some periods of political history and the activity of our previous political leaders, I think that my generation first and foremost remembers not the drawbacks, the problems and mistakes made under the leadership of Khrushchev by our our party and state. Rather, we remember that his actions, his very bold, courageous actions, championing peace and the consolidation of relations between the United States and the Soviet Union, namely his trip to the United States. Although there were objections, as far as my information goes, there were objections in certain circles in the U.S., and I think there were some doubts also in Soviet circles as well regarding that trip. And right now, too, there are critical assessments, positive and negative, of the events which took place during the period when the leadership of the party and the state were under Brezhnev. But at the same time, my generation and my children remember those actions connected with his initiatives, with the fact that he expressed initiatives of the Soviet Union and of the Soviet leadership on a number of questions which are vital for the existence of mankind: arms limitation, attempts to come to an agreement, the SALT I agreement, the conclusion of SALT II, a termless agreement regarding limitations on anti-ballistic systems, the ABM Treaty, his activity designed to normalize relations with the Federal Republic of Germany, etc., despite the fact, I repeat, that we are critical in assessing some of the actions of that period, in particular regarding our domestic policy. Regarding activities of Mikhail Gorbachev right now, it seems to me that even the most critical point of view, I'm following Mr. Reid's method here. If I were speaking independently, if he hadn't spoken, perhaps I would use a different kind of method and analysis in talking and in analyzing political events. But it seems to me, I repeat then, that no matter how critical we may be of the activity of our leadership right now, but Gorbachev and our present party and Soviet leadership, from my point of view, cannot be reproached with anything substantive. We cannot make any substantive criticisms of the kind of activity in which they're engaged in on the international front. Although mention is made here of certain surprises, I don't think these are real surprises on our part. Regarding the role of women, I think that thousands of years ago, the idea was proposed as to how women can in fact put an end to war. Excuse me. Up to now I assumed, but maybe I'm going beyond the bounds of my competence, that the right to joke here was given only to legislators. But since we're having this reorganization of perestroika, I'd like to remind you of Aristophanes' comedy, The Women, when they all got together once and finally said that if men don't stop wars, then they'll never be able to enjoy their wives in any sense, the most literal or the most figurative. That's, of course, a joke. But I'd like to say that the broadest strata of the population in our country, the efforts made by women, old men, children, party members, non-party members, representatives of all nationalities, generations, professions, etc., despite the fact that my colleagues here already stated, legislators stated that during... everyone agrees on one thing. Let me finish my sentence, please. Everyone agrees on support for the initiative of our government in the international sphere in stimulating those initiatives and in expanding the sphere in which we can have contacts with each other and get to understand each other better. Thank you very much. Question?
Thank you, Mr. Gulyayev. We have a question from Senator Cranston.
I have less of a question and more of a statement I'd like to make at this point. I am participating in this exchange of views between American leaders and Soviet leaders because of my conviction that the American-Soviet relationship between our countries and our people is the most important relationship that has ever existed between two peoples. In the whole history of mankind, we were indispensable to each other in World War II. It took us together with other allies to defeat Adolf Hitler. Now, we are the only two nations that have ever possessed the power, because of nuclear weapons, totally to destroy each other in an instant, and quite possibly the entire human race, other innocent bystanders. So the management, the handling of our relationship is incredibly important. And I would like to stress that it cannot be just a relationship between your leadership and our leadership. It has to be between our people. We have to develop a common understanding. And as further of these exchanges are broadcast over our television and your television to the people, that can be the beginning of this process of greater understanding. But we have to have relationships at other levels, the freest possible exchange of people moving back and forth. We have a sister city program where American cities relate to cities in some other country. It would be great if we could have that kind of a relationship between some of our communities and yours, where local leaders would become acquainted with each other. We need student exchanges. It would be great if some of our universities could establish a relationship with your universities and exchange students, exchange teachers, exchange professors, and if we can have our business and cultural and other relationships develop in that way. And whatever you can do to persuade your leadership that we must have this kind of an exchange, I assure you we will be doing all we can to see that we develop that here.
Okay. Leonid.
Yes, I'm listening. I'd like to answer. The problem is that Mr. Zagladin would like to answer that very short statement made by Senator Cranston.
Mr. Cranston, I'm very happy to hear what you had to say, and I listen with great pleasure. We know each other for a long time, and it's always good to hear good things from a good friend. Indeed, the development of contacts between us and at the governmental, at the parliamentary, at the city, at the citizens level, all of these are very important, and we're going to do everything possible to see that it happens. As problems arise, we have to overcome them. But let me go back to what Mr. Reid said. He said we often take a kind of see the worst in each other's actions. As far as we're concerned, that isn't true. But sometimes we do distrust one another. You distrust us, we mistrust you. It's a mutual mistrust, and this, I think, is the problem which we should really deal with. And what Mr. Cranston said shows a way of doing this, because it's important jointly to overcome this mistrust. What the cosmonaut said at the beginning was, it's not important what you eat, but who you eat with. We can say now, looking at you on the screen, that there are people that we can deal with. Of course, we knew that already with Senator Cranston, since he was in Moscow recently, and we want to continue our contact with him. Now, I'm just joking in a sense, but obviously we have to continue our meetings. I don't want to exaggerate, but at the same time we shouldn't reduce the significance.
Bill, you have the floor.
Yes, what I'd like to do is ask our delegation, we plan a series of space bridges. We hope to have 10 of them. Where would you like to be at the end of these space bridges? What's your vision for these space bridges? Why don't we start with Congressman Brown?
Well, an earlier point was brought up about the question of treaty violations and the difficulties that this causes when one side accuses the other side of treaty violations, and there is no way to deal with this. Well, we have an institution to deal with this, the Standing Consultative Committee, which takes these up and tries to analyze whether there have been violations or not. But it acts in secret and with a very small number of people, and the public never hears about it, like most people in government don't hear about it. We had an independent study made recently by a group at Stanford, which looked at treaty violations and came to the conclusions that I gather you came to in Moscow, that they weren't all that serious. Now, this happens to be the same conclusion the Standing Consultative Committee came to, but they were not allowed to publicize the results of their analysis, and they weren't allowed to negotiate out the remaining differences that existed here. I'm talking about communication.
We've got to open up our societies. There's no reason that people shouldn't be allowed to leave at their own will and visit. Secondly, I think there should be no censorship. And for example, of great concern to the American side is that our ideas are blocked. For instance, Voice of America is jammed. For instance, our books aren't allowed to come freely into the Soviet Union. And so what I would like to ask our Soviet counterparts, is there any hope in this new openness in your society that you will let our ideas come into your society freely, particularly Voice of America, particularly our books, our literature, our poetry, our political tomes?
Leonid?
Yes, comrades, who would like to answer that? Nikolai, go ahead.
Let me avail myself of my right to protest against the leaders on both sides, the moderators on both sides, who are permitting serious discrimination against economists. And this is something I shall want to protest against, and attention should be directed to it. This permits me to make a proposal, and undoubtedly we will not be able to devote much attention to this issue today, but the next time I hope that one of the subjects to discuss will be this question, namely the two rich countries, the national wealth of the Soviet Union, the value of the trees, the land, the mineral wealth might be worth 4 trillion rubles. And 20% of that is the possessions of the citizens. And our national economy has solved a whole series of major economic tasks. Now, why can we not, as parliamentarians on both sides, work together to intensify our economic ties and our scientific ties, that we have ways of increasing trade, import and exports, and other issues? I'd like to see some answer to that question.
Thank you. Thank you for your answer. Thank you for your answer and your criticism. I think not only Soviets, participants, but the Americans will also take it into account. Thank you for jumping ahead of us, because right now we're going to already start discussing the subject matter for our next space bridges.
I would not like to leave the question unanswered.
Sure.
Yeah, let's go back to the question that was raised. Please go ahead if you're ready to answer it.
I think we're sort of interrupting one another here, but still, let me agree with what Mr. Leach said, that we should know one another better and respect one another more, and there should be more openness.
We need more openness to get to know each other.
I'm being translated back into Russian, apparently. This is one of the goals which we will strive for together. But there's one reservation. Mr. Leach talks about openness. We do not consider our society to be closed. It's more and more open, in fact, and will continue to be that way. But nonetheless, we see different contents here. We say the same words, but we understand these words differently sometimes. And this would be another topic for discussion, by the way. Openness, as you understand it, could sort of mean that the person can do whatever he wants. And our openness has certain limits on the social freedom. And what are the limits? Now, you will not be offended at me if I say that our limitations are closer to Christian morality than sometimes seem to us is the case in the United States. And our openness has certain framework which is created by the moral standards of our society. Now, this is again a subject for discussion. This sort of contrast has never been discussed before. Another point, there are obviously questions which remain over from the periods of confrontation between our two countries in the past, and which will change as our relations change and as the situation changes. They're already starting to change, but undoubtedly they could change a good deal more and will in function of our relations between you and me. And if you, Mr. Leach and I, can understand each other better and strive ourselves to help change the climate and the atmosphere, I'm sure that this will contribute to overall progress.
Yes, you wanted to continue. You see, now regarding Voice of America, Comrade Gorbachev made a proposal. Let us lease a radio station